For 9 months, Russian engineers laid track through occupied Donetsk. New rail lines stitched between Olenivka-Dokuchayevsk and Starobashevo, a private highway of steel built for one purpose: to have the distance supplies travel to the front and to feed the war machine faster than ever before. Moscow was certain it had finally solved its logistics problem. It had built itself a fortress of iron and timetables, and it believed that fortress was untouchable. It was wrong. Every junction it welded into place became a fixed coordinate on a Ukrainian targeting map. The wagons that were meant to carry shells to the front are now carrying nothing but smoke into the sky. Today, let's see how the railway Russia built to win the war became the trap that strangled it. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Russia was trying to do. An army does not run on courage. It runs on diesel, on shells, on bread, and bullets hauled forward every single day. And in a war this size, almost all of it moves by rail. Russia knew this better than anyone. It is a doctrine the Soviet Union wrote in blood. So, when Moscow's overland link to Crimea came under sustained Ukrainian fire, the Kremlin did something methodical, something patient, something that should have worked. It built new railways. For roughly 9 months, Russian crews laid track in a square of occupied territory near Donetsk between Olenivka-Dokuchayevsk, Starobashevo, and Mospino, tying it into the line that runs through Donetsk-Volnovakha and down to Mariupol. The goal, according to investigators tracking the construction, was to cut the delivery distance to the front roughly in half, run more military trains, and rotate soldiers and equipment faster across the eastern and southern fronts. Olenivka sat at the heart of it as a working rail hub. Dokuchayevsk, an old quarry town 40 kilometers south of Donetsk, anchored the road and rail crossings that fed the whole system. And Russia did not stop at building, it fortified. Along the line between Olenivka and Volnovakha, Russian forces assembled a wall of roughly 2,100 freight carriages stretched across some 30 kilometers, a structure open-source analysts nicknamed the Tsar Train. The Institute for the Study of War assessed it was likely meant as an obstacle, a physical barrier against a future Ukrainian advance. Think about what that tells you. This was not a frightened army. This was a confident one, building permanent infrastructure deep in its rear, treating that ground as conquered, settled, and safe. All of this was building toward one thing: an offensive. By early 2026, Russia had massed an enormous force on Ukrainian soil. Figures cited by Ukraine's top commander put it around 700,000 troops, including reserves. In late March, Moscow moved heavy equipment and men to the front and opened its spring push, and the Institute for the Study of War confirmed the offensive was underway. Every year when the snow melts, Russia turns the grind up a gear. The fuel and the shells for that push were piling up exactly where the generals wanted them, at the rail and road junctions of Dokuchayevsk, of Olenivka, of a dozen quiet towns behind the line. The arteries were full, the fortress was ready, and Russia was certain those arteries were safe. And to grasp how much Russia was betting on this railway, you have to understand why it needed it so desperately. For most of the war, Moscow's lifeline to occupied Crimea ran across the Kerch Strait Bridge, Vladimir Putin's pride, the single most important link between Russia and the peninsula. Ukraine spent 2 years degrading that bridge strike after strike until Moscow could no longer count on it. What remained was the R-280 highway, the so-called Novorossiya route running from Rostov-on-Don through occupied Mariupol-Berdyansk and Melitopol into Crimea, together with the rail lines Russia was racing to build alongside it. Almost overnight, those routes stopped being one option among many. They became the artery, the single channel through which the entire southern front and Crimea itself now had to breathe. Russia had funneled its lifeblood into a handful of predictable lines. Then it handed Ukraine the perfect weapon to find them. But the fortress Russia spent 9 months building had one flaw its engineers never planned for. And in the first week of spring, that flaw stopped being a theory and started being a fire. The flaw was the sky. And the weapon that exploited it costs less than a used car. Meet the Hornet, a small strike drone built by Perennial Autonomy, a company founded by former Google chief executive Eric Schmidt. It costs around $5,000. It carries a 5-kilogram warhead. It has a range of up to 200 kilometers, semi-autonomous targeting, and it can be churned out by the thousand. On its own, it is almost nothing. Multiplied across an entire front, it is a revolution. Here is where the asymmetry becomes almost absurd. A $5,000 drone hunts down a fuel tanker worth 100 times more and the soldiers around it and the road they were driving on. Ukrainian units made it deadlier still with a battlefield improvisation. The Azov Corps bolted a Starlink satellite link onto the Hornet, sharply increasing its range and its resistance to Russian jamming. According to Rob Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an expert on the Russian military, the drone's maker welcomed the modification. They wanted anything that made the weapon more effective. So now the cheapest thing in the sky can reach the most expensive things on the ground 200 kilometers behind the line. How do you defend against that? For months, Russia has not had a good answer, and the Hornet is only one weapon in a flood. Ukraine is now manufacturing strike drones on an industrial scale, and according to its own commander-in-chief, unmanned systems already account for roughly 60% of all the damage Ukraine inflicts on Russian forces along the front. The drone is no longer a clever supplement to the war. On Ukraine's side, it is becoming the war itself, and when a weapon this cheap becomes this central, the entire economic logic of the conflict tilts, because Russia simply cannot afford to keep losing trucks and tankers worth $100,000 to drones worth $5,000 day after day with no end in sight. And this is the part Moscow truly underestimated. It is not one strike. It is a campaign. Ukraine has been hitting targets at operational depth roughly 25 to 200 kilometers behind the front for well over a year. But the explicit, systematic hunting of supply trucks and logistics is new, and it began in earnest in early April. The numbers tell the story of a noose pulling tight. The open-source monitoring group Tochny geolocated 55 strikes on Russian logistics vehicles in April. In May, that number jumped to 130, and it was climbing by the day. Behind those numbers are real convoys turned to scrap. According to a senior analyst at the Kyiv-based Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center, military intelligence sources counted around 125 Russian trucks hit on key routes with more than 80 destroyed or burned out. And even that, the analyst cautioned, likely undercounts the losses. The Azov Corps alone has published footage of more than 50 strikes on key roads, including the so-called Novorossiya route, the R-280 highway linking Rostov-on-Don to occupied Crimea, through a string of captured Ukrainian cities. On one night in late May, Ukrainian military intelligence drones managed to shut that highway down entirely for a time, leaving fuel tankers burning and forcing the rest of the traffic into long, exposed detours. And the campaign keeps widening. Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov announced a dedicated program called Logistical Lockdown, pouring roughly $113 million into the units doing this work with the stated aim of systematically destroying Russian capabilities in the operational depth and stripping the army of its ability to attack. New brigades are joining with new weapons. One unit announced a large-scale hunt for enemy logistics in the south using secret loitering munitions that had never appeared in public before. The noose is not one rope. It is dozens tightening at once. The clearest picture of what this campaign does is not in Donetsk at all. It is on that southern highway, the R-280. Analysts tracking the route recorded a single staggering day on May 29, 483 Russian transport vehicles neutralized in 24 hours. The most heavily targeted point is the Berdyansk junction, where the coastal road narrows into a bottleneck, and every truck that burns there is a truck that never reaches the front. What makes this dangerous is not any single strike. It is the cumulative weight of all of them. Russia can replace a depot. It can repair a bridge, but it cannot make a road any wider, and it cannot stop being predictable about where its supplies are forced to go. The geography Russia conquered has quietly become the geography that traps it, and these are not abstract dots on a map. In one widely shared video, a charred Russian truck sits at the roadside while soldiers struggle to replace its melted tires, and a second drone falls almost silently out of the sky toward the men trying to recover it, the footage cutting out an instant before impact. The Azov Corps has flown its drones over the Donbass arena in occupied Donetsk and back above Mariupol, the city where the unit fought its bloody last stand in the steelworks during the first months of the invasion. The message in those flights is not subtle. The places Russia believed it had taken forever are once again under Ukrainian eyes, and here the eye that watches is also the hand that strikes. Which brings us to the last day of May, and to the strike that pulled this whole story into focus. On May 31st, the 413th Regiment of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, a unit that goes by the call sign RAID, carried out what it called a comprehensive strike on the operational rear of Russian forces in occupied Donetsk. In their own words, the target sat at the junctions of major railway lines and road networks. In other words, the exact logistics hubs where the enemy had been concentrating personnel and resources for further offensive operations. The drones struck two military logistics depots near Novoselivka and Dokuchayevsk. They hit a temporary deployment site and several more depots in the village of Sinalny near Olenivka. Read those names again because they are not random. Dokuchayevsk and Olenivka are precisely the nodes of the rail square Russia spent 9 months building. The fuel, the ammunition, the staging, everything Russia had moved forward for its offensive was sitting right there at the crossings. And some of this ground has been under Russian control since 2014. For 11 years, this was the deepest, calmest, safest corner of the occupation. On May 31st, it was on fire, and it was not happening in isolation. On that very same day, hundreds of kilometers north, Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps announced that its drones now controlled the skies over Russian supply routes across occupied Luhansk, naming city after city where its drones were operating freely. The same week, Ukrainian drones reached deep enough to strike a key oil pipeline node and a major refinery inside Russia itself. Picture the map. From Luhansk in the north, down through the Donetsk rail square along the southern highways to Crimea, Russia's entire logistical spine is being worked over at once. Dokuchayevsk is not the story. Dokuchayevsk is one knot in it. And notice who carried this out. Not an improvised team of volunteers, but the 413th Regiment of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, a formal, dedicated branch of the military built entirely around drone warfare. Ukraine did not simply stumble into this capability. It institutionalized it, gave it regiments called signs and doctrine, and now a $113 million funding line aimed squarely at Russia's rear. The strikes on Dokuchayevsk and Sinalny were not a lucky raid. They were a machine doing precisely what it was designed to do. That is the difference between a stunt and a strategy, and it is the difference Russia is only beginning to feel. Now here is the question that decides everything. Is any of this actually hurting Russia, or is it just spectacular video? The answer is showing up where it always does, first at the gas station. In occupied Sevastopol in Crimea, filling stations ran dry of gasoline and diesel was only sporadically available, according to the city's Russian-appointed governor. In occupied Melitopol and Mariupol, residents posted footage of long lines of cars queuing for fuel as supplies thinned and prices climbed. This is what a severed artery looks like from the ground, not on a map, but at the pump in the panic of ordinary occupied life. The strain is forcing Russia to react in the most telling way possible by retreating. According to a former drone operator with Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, earlier waves of these strikes already pushed some Russian units to cut their diesel use by as much as 20% and to move ammunition depots and command posts further back from the line. In some cases, he said literally, back into Russia out of occupied Ukraine. And Russia's own collaborationist officials are admitting the problem in writing. The Moscow-installed governor of occupied Kherson issued a decree in late May, restricting non-essential traffic on the AR-280 highway, openly citing the threat of Ukrainian drones. When the occupier starts rationing the roads, you no longer need anyone to tell you the lifeline is bleeding. It would be easy to dismiss all of this as Ukrainian propaganda. Bold claims, dramatic footage, victory talk. So let's set the cheerleaders aside and listen to the most cautious voice in the room, the Institute for the Study of War, the Washington think tank whose entire job is to assess this conflict soberly. The Institute has confirmed that Ukrainian forces are reconnoitering and interdicting Russian ground lines of communication near occupied Mariupol at depths of up to 160 kilometers, and that the intensifying mid-range strike campaign of early 2026 is degrading Russia's ability to conduct offensive operations. That is not a Ukrainian press release. That is the most measured analysis available, and it says the same thing the burning depots do. And the battlefield math backs it up. The Institute assessed that Russian advances across the entire theater slowed in the first 4 months of 2026 to an average of just under 3 square kilometers a day, and that in April, Russia actually suffered a net loss of territory. Think about that. Russia massed 700,000 troops, built a railway to feed them, stockpiled the shells, launched its spring offensive, and went backwards. Now, an honest analysis demands honesty about the limits too. Rob Lee, the Russian military expert, argues the campaign will clearly have some effect on Russia's ability to attack, while cautioning that the overall impact is still unclear and that Russia will inevitably try to adapt. Nobody serious is declaring the war over, but the trend is not subtle and it is not moving Moscow's way. So why can't Russia simply adapt? It will certainly try. Rob Lee argues the central question now is how Moscow responds, and that to counter the threat, Russia would have to dedicate more air defense systems, more electronic warfare assets, and more mobile air defense teams to protecting its rear. But here lies Russia's deeper problem. It has far fewer of those to spare than it once did. Ukraine's previous campaign spent months hunting Russian air defense systems across the occupied territories, and hundreds were hit and destroyed. In other words, before Ukraine ever started burning the supply lines, it had already blinded many of the very systems Russia would now need to shield them. If Moscow cannot find an effective countermeasure, Lee warns this year only grows harder as it goes on. So, where does this end? To see it follow the dominoes. A truck that burns at Dokuchayevsk is a shell that never reaches the gun. A shell that never reaches the gun is an attack that stalls. An attack that stalls is fuel pulled from somewhere else to keep it moving, which means another sector goes hungry and another truck burns trying to feed it. This is how logistics failures cascade. They do not announce themselves with one great collapse. They spread quietly like cracks through a wall until the wall is no longer a wall, just a pile of bricks that used to be a fortress. And the people most afraid of this collapse are not Ukrainians. They are Russians. Russian military bloggers, the men who cheer Moscow's war for a living, are sounding the alarm in their own channels. One complained bluntly that Ukraine is just burning everything down, and that for now, there is no solution. A Russian war correspondent warned that unless urgent action is taken in the coming months, logistics will collapse. Another wrote that areas of the Russian rear once considered relatively safe have not been safe for months. An advisor to Ukraine's defense minister put it more simply. This, he said, will be the worst and hardest summer for the Russians, and the worst is yet to come. When the propagandists of both sides finally agree on something, it is usually because the facts have stopped taking sides. History has seen this story before, and it rarely ends well for the army on the wrong side of it. Napoleon supposedly warned that an army marches on its stomach. The German war machine that swept across this very land in 1941 did not die only on the battlefield. It died at the end of an overstretched supply line it could not feed. And Russia, of all armies, should have remembered the most recent lesson of all its own. In the opening weeks of the full-scale invasion in 2022, a Russian armored column dozens of kilometers long ground to a halt outside Kyiv, not because it was beaten in battle, but because it ran out of fuel and food and simply stopped. The Soviet Union itself, the empire whose doctrine Russia inherited, was bled white over years less by any single defeat than by the slow grinding cost of a war it could not sustain. Russia built a railway to escape that fate. Instead, it built the trap. And there is one more possibility hiding inside all of this, the one that should trouble Moscow most. Analysts tracking the campaign suggest that if Ukraine keeps raising the tempo, it could do more than merely bleed Russian logistics. It could cut off the supply to specific sectors of the front entirely. And a sector that cannot be resupplied is a sector that can be attacked. The same drones strangling Russia's offensive could in time open the door to a Ukrainian one. That remains a hypothesis, not a headline. But it reframes everything you have just seen, because this is no longer only Ukraine playing defense. It is Ukraine quietly deciding which side gets to choose where the next blow falls. None of this means the war ends tomorrow. Russia is vast, it is stubborn, and it will pour engineers' jammers and air defenses at this problem until it finds some answer. The honest verdict is narrower, and it is harder for Moscow to argue with the safest ground Russia held has stopped being safe. The railway it built to win has become a liability, it has to defend, and the cheapest weapon on the battlefield is now dictating terms to the most expensive one. A fortress is only as strong as the road that feeds it. Russia forgot that. And from Dokuchayevsk to the gates of Crimea, it is being reminded one burning junction at a time. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If a $5,000 drone can strangle the supply lines of a 700,000-man army, what does that say about the future of war and about every fortress everywhere that still believes its rear is safe? Share your answer in the comments. I read them, and the best ones genuinely shape how these stories get told. If this breakdown helped the map make sense, subscribe and turn on notifications because this campaign is moving fast and we will be tracking every shift. And if you would rather listen than watch, you can find us on Spotify, perfect for long drives and long journeys when you want the full picture in your ears. And we will see you at the next crossroads.